Howdy folks. A few months ago I had the privilege of participating in the Battle Days Living History event to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Point Pleasant, the only major engagement of Lord Dunmore's War. Now if you clicked on this video, I assume you already know what Lord Dunmore's War is, but just in case. In the spring of 1774, tensions between the tribes of the Ohio country and the colony of Virginia boiled over following the murder of the family of the Mingo chief Logan. Shawnee and Mingo war parties attacked Virginia settlements for most of that summer, culminating in the Battle of Point Pleasant on October 10th of that year. Colonel Andrew Lewis's Virginia militia defeated the natives under Chief Cornstalk of the Shawnee. The next month, the royal governor Lord Dunmore, hence the name of the war, ended the conflict with the Treaty of Camp Charlotte. As to the Battle Days event at Point Pleasant, it went great. All the reenactors there were on their A game. We had a parade, student groups came through, there was a memorial service for the battle, there were lectures. I even got to bring down my dugout canoe, the Chief Logan, which was a pretty big hit. In order to prep for the event, I figured I needed to finally get around to reading this book, Dunmore's War, by Glenn F. Williams, who's a historian for the U.S. Army. This came out in 2017. It's 393 pages, including notes and indices. The paperback cost $23, and it's the most up-to-date and detailed scholarship on Dunmore's War. Now, there is a lot to commend about this book. Williams quotes extensively from primary sources and covers the lead up to the war and the progression of the conflict itself in really granular detail. In fact, maybe it's a little too detailed in some respects, which is kind of a non-criticism, but certain parts of the book, like the discussion of Virginia's militia policy and the organization of the county militias in Chapter 4, and then later on parts about the mobilization of the militia during the war, especially down in the southern counties like Fincastle County. In certain parts like that, really all I could think of was, get over there! Logistics and all that stuff is obviously important, it's just not very easy reading. One part of the book that I really did like was that Williams paid a lot of attention to the border dispute that was ongoing between Virginia and Pennsylvania when the war broke out. At the time, the two colonies were wrangling over the ownership of the land between the Monongahela River and the Ohio River, including modern-day Pittsburgh. And I'll never not be mad that Pennsylvania eventually won that dispute, because if they hadn't, then all that land would be rightfully West Virginia territory now. Now, because there was a lot of bad blood between Virginia and Pennsylvania at the time, it was not uncommon during the war for the Pennsylvanians to play the Ohio tribes off against the Virginians. In fact, one of my favorite parts of the book covers this in detail. The Indians marveled at the contrast between what they had experienced firsthand and what they had expected from listening to the Pennsylvanians' quote, terrible accounts of the Virginians intending to cut them off, meaning destroy them, for the sake of their lands. Quite to the contrary, these Delawares found the Virginians a good people. During and after the war, when sources and accounts were being written, the anti-Virginia attitude found its way into a lot of stuff that Pennsylvanians wrote down, and this has, according to Williams, skewed the historiography of the war, and made out the Virginians as just interested in a big land grab in the Ohio country or fighting for selfish reasons. Addressing this is the second really strong point of the book. Williams does a great job of backing up his main thesis, which is that the war was primarily defensive from Virginia's perspective. Virginia's acquisition of Indian land between 1768 and 1772 met the established legal requirements, conformed to the restrictions set forth in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and were ratified by the British Crown. Careful analysis of the comprehensive sources cited in the narrative supports the suspicion that Virginia's soldiers primarily fought a defensive war against unprovoked Shawnee and Mingo attacks on the south bank of the Ohio. The war-ending Treaty of Camp Charlotte proved far less draconian than one would expect from an aggressor bent on land acquisition through conquest and genocidal extermination. Now, even though I agree in outline with the thesis here, this does lead me into some of my criticisms, because the focus on the war is primarily defensive, fails to look at the conflict within the wider context of settler colonialism. Even if Dunmore's war in isolation wasn't a land grab per se, and it was defensive from the Virginia perspective, it was still part of a larger colonial project. I think Williams missed a big piece of the puzzle when he didn't really discuss that broader colonial context. Now, a more serious problem I had is that the book really isn't so much a history of Lord Dunmore's war as it is a military history of the Virginia militia in Lord Dunmore's war. And as such, it unfortunately lacks close discussion of the war from the perspective of the native tribes who fought in it. Chapter 1 does give some pretty valuable background on all the intertribal politics that kind of primed the Shawnee for the warpath, but the lead-up and course of the war is viewed almost entirely from the perspective of the Virginians who wrote about it. For example, the movement of Chief Logan and the war parties he led into Virginia during the war. He, more than anyone else, was fighting a one-man war against Virginia. He brought the Shawnees into it over the murder of his family at the beginning of the war. So his movements are very important to understanding the conflict, but his movements really don't get a lot of detailed attention except when he actually shows up at a Virginia settlement. There's not really an attempt to look at them for their own sake, or to look at the decisions that were being made within indigenous military leadership during the war. Obviously, this is somewhat understandable because we don't have very many sources for what was going on within the native leadership during the war. But given how detailed Williams is on stuff like militia organization and other details that really aren't quite as immediately significant, I think this was a big missed opportunity. So on these 2 points, the book really just doesn't have its priorities straight. But really, I think my biggest problem with it is that in a lot of ways, it's just really poorly written. To give a couple examples, with most history books, especially ones meant for the general public, but even in academic ones, and this is kind of in between, you'll get a small biography, or at least a fair bit of background information on the major characters. With the exception of Lord Dunmore, Williams doesn't really do this. Very significant individuals like Chief Cornstalk, Chief Logan, General Andrew Lewis, they're introduced with minimal background information about their lives. It would have been very interesting to at least have some of that information in here. It would have made it feel more complete. Another problem is that in the 315 pages of actual narrative history here, there are only 3 or 4 maps. And considering how detailed the descriptions of the movements of different persons and military units are, this really needed more visual aids. I'm from the region being described here. I know it pretty well, and even I was lost without more maps. Also, the way the book presents its chronology is really confusing. Williams will write something like, "On May 15th, Chief White Eyes went to the Wapatomica village and did this." But then for the next several pages, the only chronological markers we get are 2 days later, or on the following Monday, or 3 days previous. And because a lot of the events being described overlap, it's almost impossible to suss out exactly what is happening when. So to wrap up, there were a lot of aspects of this book that were really frustrating. But despite its flaws, it is still undeniably the most up-to-date scholarship on Dunmore's War. None of what I've talked about here is deal breakers. They're just things to keep in mind as you read it, so I would still recommend this book if you want to do a deep dive into Dunmore's War. But it definitely should not be the first thing you read on the subject. If you're looking for a more reader-friendly introduction to Dunmore's War, then I would recommend this book, That Dark and Bloody River by Alan W. Eckert. at first glance, may not seem super reader friendly. This is, 700 pages long? But the first 2 chapters cover the lead up to the conflict and the aftermath of Dunmore's War. It's not as rigorous as Williams' work. This is kind of a condensation and correction of the series of historical novels that Eckert wrote about the Ohio frontier, but it still gives you the outline, and it's very readable. And I haven't read this one yet, but I recently picked up Heart of American Darkness by Bob Parkinson. Now, this isn't a straight history of Dunmore's War. It's more of a dual biography of the Cresap family and the Shikellamy family, which were major players on both sides of the conflict. So it looks at the war and the history of the Ohio frontier in general from the perspective of these 2 families. I'll get back to you on this one once I've read it. It just strikes me as a better introduction to the war in the general context. So I guess that wraps it up. Like I said, check out Glenn Williams' Dunmore's War if you want a good deep dive. Keep my criticisms in mind, or don't, if you don't care. I'm just an unqualified undergrad, so whatever. But either way, thanks for tuning in, and Godspeed to you.